The morning I found out what my mother-in-law had done, I was standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, listening to my florist cry on the phone. Not sniffling. Crying. The full, broken kind that comes from a woman who's been in business for 23 years and just found out someone tried to erase a $14,000 contract with a single phone call she was never supposed to know about. "Someone called last Tuesday claiming to be you," she said. "She gave your name. Your wedding date. She said there'd been a family emergency and everything needed to be cancelled immediately." I set the mug down on the counter very slowly. "That wasn't me, Renata." "I know," she said. "Because I pulled the original contract and every single signature on it is yours. Every payment came from your account." She had no authority. I stood there in the quiet of my kitchen, 6 weeks before my wedding, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic. Not heartbreak. Something colder and more useful than either of those things. Clarity. Because here's what Sandra Hollis did not know when she picked up the phone and tried to cancel my florist, my caterer, my photographer, my venue coordinator, and my string quartet in a single Tuesday afternoon. Every contract, every deposit, every final payment was in my name. Mine alone. And I had kept every receipt. If you're just finding this channel, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. What I'm about to tell you took me 2 years to fully understand and about 45 minutes to undo. Stay with me. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not to the wedding. To the dinner. The first dinner. The one where I understood exactly what kind of woman my future mother-in-law was going to be. Daniel and I had been together for 8 months when he took me to his parents' house in Pembroke Hills for Sunday supper. It was October, the kind of evening where the leaves are still orange and the air smells like someone's already burning something. The Hollis house was large in that particular way that announces itself without saying a word. Stone facade, circular driveway, a garden that had clearly been tended by someone other than the people who lived there. I wore a navy wrap dress and brought a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford on my salary at the time. I was 29 years old and a junior architect at a mid-size firm in the city, making $58,000 a year and paying rent on a 1-bedroom in a neighborhood that was almost nice. Not impressive by Sandra Hollis's metrics, I would learn. But I didn't know her metrics yet. Daniel's father, Robert, answered the door. He was tall, quiet, the kind of man who fills a room without speaking and has learned that this is usually enough. He shook my hand, smiled, and said, "Evelyn, welcome," and for a fraction of a second I thought maybe this would be fine. Sandra appeared behind him in a linen blouse the color of cream. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a price tag she already knows is wrong. Not rude. Not overtly unkind. Just assessing. She took the wine bottle from my hands, glanced at the label, and set it on the entry table with the particular gentleness of someone who has no intention of opening it. "Daniel's told us so much," she said. What she meant was, "Daniel's told us you're not what we expected." I know this now. I didn't know it then. Dinner was roast chicken and twice-baked potatoes and a salad that had been dressed by someone who treated vinaigrette like a science. Sandra had cooked all of it herself, which she mentioned 3 times in the first 20 minutes. She asked me about my work. I explained that I was an architect, that I specialized in residential renovations, that I was working toward my licensure exam. She nodded in the way that people nod when they are storing information not because they find it interesting but because they intend to use it later. "How creative," she said. The word creative landed like a compliment wrapped around a slight. The kind of thing you can't argue with because technically it's positive. She asked how long the licensure process took. I told her it could be several years depending on experience hours. She said, "Daniel got his MBA in 2. The Whitmore Accelerated program. He was one of 15 accepted that year." I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his plate. He had the expression of a man who had heard this particular sentence before. Many times. Robert refilled my water glass and changed the subject to the weather, which I understood was the only safe harbor at this table. That was dinner number 1. By dinner number 7, I had compiled a working theory of Sandra Hollis. She was not a cruel woman in the way that people are cruel out of malice. She was a curator. She had a specific vision of what her son's life was supposed to look like, and she had been curating it for 34 years, and my arrival had disrupted the exhibition. The woman she had selected in her mind for Daniel was someone whose family she already knew. Someone from Pembroke Hills or somewhere adjacent. Someone whose resume read like a continuation of the Hollis family narrative rather than an interruption of it. I was an interruption. My parents were a high school music teacher and a retired postal worker from a small town in central Pennsylvania. We had one bathroom growing up and a screen door that never quite closed all the way. I was the first person in my family to earn a professional degree, which I had done on a combination of scholarships, loans, and 4 years of working Friday nights at a restaurant where the uniforms were genuinely uncomfortable. Sandra knew all of this because Daniel had told her and because Sandra Hollis conducted research the way some people conduct prayer. Quietly, thoroughly, and with absolute conviction that the results would confirm what she already believed. She never said anything directly negative. That was not her method. Her method was the offhand comment. The gentle redirect. The question that was not actually a question. "Do your parents get up to the city often?" she asked once, in the middle of a conversation about Thanksgiving plans. I said my mother had a bad knee and didn't love the drive. Sandra nodded. That's so hard. Daniel's parents are always involved. We believe in staying close. Involved. I filed that word away. It would become important. Daniel proposed in February, 14 months after that first dinner. He did it quietly, on a Tuesday evening, in my apartment, with a ring he had chosen himself and a speech he had clearly been practicing and a sincerity so unguarded it made my chest hurt in the best possible way. I said yes. I meant it completely. I still mean it. Whatever happened with his mother, Daniel was never the problem. He was the man I was marrying. The problem was what his mother believed she was owed because of that. The engagement was announced at a family dinner 3 weeks later. Sandra hugged me for the first time. She held both of my hands and looked at my face and said, "We're going to plan this together. I've been waiting for this moment for years." I smiled. I told her I was so glad. I meant both of those things in the moment. I also did not yet understand what together meant in Sandra Hollis's vocabulary. Together meant Sandra. Together meant her vision, her vendors, her timeline, her guest list, her choices softened with enough inclusive language that disagreement became socially complicated. The first planning meeting was at her house. She had printed an agenda. An actual printed agenda, with bullet points, at a meeting about my wedding. She had already spoken to the Rosecliff estate about availability. Rosecliff was a venue I had never mentioned because I had never been there and did not particularly want to go there. It held 350 people. My vision was something closer to 80. She had a contact at Whitmore Floral, she said, long-standing relationship, they do all the Pembroke Hills events. She had a photographer in mind as well. He did the Carmichael wedding last spring, she said, sliding a printed photo across the table. Stunning work. He books up fast. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the photo. He picked it up and said, "This is really beautiful, Mom." I excused myself to use the bathroom. I stood in the hallway of the Hollis house, with its framed family portraits and its faint smell of cedar and good hand soap, and I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that settles in your chest and changes the direction of everything without making any noise at all. I was going to plan my own wedding. I was going to do it politely, carefully, and completely. And I was going to pay for everything myself. Not because I could easily afford it. I could not easily afford it. But because I understood in that hallway, with a clarity I have never doubted since, that money was the language Sandra Hollis spoke most fluently. And whoever paid was whoever held the pen. My salary had grown. I was 31 by then, fully licensed, and had moved to a senior associate position at the firm. I was earning $91,000 a year. I had been saving aggressively for 3 years because saving aggressively was what my parents had taught me by example when there was never quite enough. I had $38,000 in a dedicated account I had labeled, without irony, future. I went back to the table. I listened to the rest of Sandra's agenda. I said the right things. I asked questions that implied engagement without committing to anything. I was very good at this. Architects spend a great deal of time listening to what clients say they want while understanding that what they want and what will actually work are frequently two different things. Sandra was a client. She just didn't know it yet. Over the following 3 weeks, I made every booking myself. I called Renata at Bloom and Branch, a florist I had found through a colleague whose wedding I had attended 2 years earlier and still thought about when I needed to remember what a room full of flowers done right actually looked like. I paid the deposit from my personal account. I called the Whitfield Inn, a property 40 minutes from the city with a garden ceremony space that held exactly 85 people and smelled like old wood and honeysuckle. I paid the venue deposit myself. I hired a photographer named Cara whose work I had been following on her website for a year, a caterer named James who had come recommended by 3 different people I trusted, and a string quartet I found through the music department at the university where I occasionally guest lectured. Every contract was signed by me. Every vendor had my phone number, my email, my name on the top line of every document. Every deposit check came from my account. Daniel knew. I want to be clear about that. I told him everything, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the contracts spread out and a spreadsheet open on my laptop. I told him I needed to do this myself. He looked at the spreadsheet. He looked at me. My mother isn't going to like this, he said. I know. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. She'll find out eventually. Yes, I said. She will. He nodded. And then he said something I keep coming back to, something I did not fully appreciate until later. Just make sure everything is documented. I looked at him. I always do, I said. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew exactly who he had agreed to marry. Sandra found out about the Whitfield in approximately 6 days after I booked it. I don't know exactly how. Pembroke Hills is a specific kind of small and Sandra Hollis was a specific kind of connected. She called Daniel first. I know this because Daniel texted me at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, Mom called. She knows about the venue. I'll handle it. He did not fully handle it. What he handled was the initial temperature. What he did not handle was the follow-up, which arrived at my door in the form of Sandra herself on a Wednesday evening, unannounced, with a bottle of wine she had actually selected this time and a smile that had been calibrated for exactly this kind of conversation. I let her in. I made tea. I sat across from her at my kitchen table and I listened to her tell me, with great warmth and unmistakable firmness, that she was not upset, she was simply concerned. The Whitfield Inn was lovely, she was sure, but it was small. Daniel had a large family. There were business colleagues of Robert's who would need to be invited. And Rosecliffe had a planner on staff who would take so much of the stress off my plate. I just want this to be perfect for you, she said. That's all I've ever wanted. I thanked her for coming. I told her I was so grateful for her involvement and that I wanted her to feel included in every meaningful way. I was specific about what I meant by meaningful. The guest list on our side, the welcome toast, the rehearsal dinner venue, which I had left entirely for her to plan and control. She smiled. She sipped her tea. She said she thought we understood each other. She went home. 2 weeks later she cancelled my florist. Then she called the Whitfield Inn. Then the photographer. Then the caterer. Then the string quartet. All in one Tuesday afternoon. She gave my name each time. She said there had been a family emergency. She said everything needed to be released immediately. She did not know that Renata at Bloom and Branch had the original contract with my signature and my bank records and 14 years of professional instinct telling her that something about this call was not right. She did not know that the Whitfield Inn had a policy, written into every agreement, that cancellations required written confirmation from the primary contract holder via a verified email address. She did not know that Kara, my photographer, had been the victim of a fraudulent cancellation 3 years earlier and had since implemented a callback verification system that had blocked Sandra's call entirely. She did not know that James, my caterer, had simply not believed the woman on the phone sounded like me and had flagged the call internally and waited. She did not know that the string quartet's director, a meticulous 70-year-old woman named Dr. Patricia Voss who had been running chamber ensembles since before Sandra was planning Pembroke Hills dinner parties, had told the caller that all cancellations required a signed letter and a refund waiver and had ended the call before anything was processed. Sandra Hollis had spent one Tuesday afternoon trying to dismantle 8 months of my careful, documented, legally binding planning. And every single person she called had held the line. Not because they knew what was happening. Because I had built relationships with vendors who took contracts seriously and because every contract had my name on it and only my name. I stood in my kitchen on that Wednesday morning, mug gone cold, and I listened to Renata finish telling me what had happened. She identified herself as your mother-in-law, Renata said. She was very confident. I'm sure she was, I said. Is the contract intact? Completely. Nothing was processed. I called you as soon as I pulled the file. I thanked her. I told her I would follow up in writing. I hung up and stood very still for a moment. Then I opened my laptop and called Kara. And then James. And then the Whitfield Inn. And then Dr. Patricia Voss, who answered with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had already composed a written record of the incident and was waiting for me to call. By 10:30 that morning I had spoken to every vendor. Every contract was intact. Every deposit was in place. Not a single cancellation had gone through. And I had, sitting in my email inbox and in 5 separate voice recordings I had quietly made while on the phone, a complete account of what had been attempted. Sandra did not know any of this. She was, as far as I could tell, sitting somewhere in Pembroke Hills believing she had just cleared the board. That was her first mistake. Her second was sending me a text at noon that day that said simply, I think we should start fresh with the planning. I've taken care of a few things that weren't working. Call me when you're ready to talk. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to my email. Then I saved it in a folder I labeled, again without irony, evidence. I put my phone face down on the counter. I picked up my coffee mug, walked to the microwave, reheated it for 90 seconds, and drank it standing at the window looking out at the street below my apartment. In 7 weeks I was getting married. Every vendor was in place. Every contract was mine. And the woman who had just tried to take it all apart had documented her own attempt in a text message and sent it to me voluntarily. I finished my coffee. Then I got dressed and went to work. I did not call Sandra that day. I did not call her the next day either. I went to work. I sat in a meeting about a residential renovation in the Garfield district and looked at load-bearing walls on a blueprint and thought about structure. About what holds a thing up and what happens when someone who doesn't understand the foundation tries to change it without permission. I was very calm. People who knew me well would have found that calmness alarming. Daniel came over that evening. He knew something had happened because I had sent him a single text at 10:35 that morning that said, Your mother called all my vendors today trying to cancel everything. All contracts are intact. I need you to know what happened before I decide how to respond. He arrived with Thai food and the expression of a man who had spent 8 hours trying to prepare himself for a conversation he knew would be significant. I told him everything, in order, with the documentation open on my laptop. The phone call from Renata. The Whitfield Inn's cancellation policy. Kara's callback verification system. James's instinct. Dr. Patricia Voss and her requirement for a signed letter. Sandra's text, which I read aloud verbatim. Daniel was quiet for a long time after I finished. He had barely touched the food. He was looking at the screen, at Sandra's text still visible in the screenshot I had saved. I think we should start fresh with the planning. I've taken care of a few things that weren't working. He read it twice that I could see. Maybe more. She genuinely thought it had worked, he said. Yes, I said. She had no idea they called me. He looked at me. What do you want to do? And here is the thing I understood about Daniel at that moment, the thing that mattered more than any of what his mother had done. He was not asking me to forgive her. He was not asking me to minimize what had happened. He was not asking me to keep the peace for the sake of the family. He was asking what I wanted to do, and he was prepared to stand behind the answer. I want to go to the rehearsal dinner, I said. I want to smile. I want to give her every opportunity to tell me herself. And if she doesn't, I want to have the conversation at a time and in a place of my choosing, with witnesses. He nodded. He did not ask me to reconsider. He picked up his fork. We ate dinner. That was the night I understood we were going to be fine. The rehearsal dinner was 2 weeks before the wedding. Sandra had planned it herself, which I had agreed to at the start of the engagement as part of the division of responsibilities I had outlined clearly and politely and then documented in an email I had sent to both her and Robert under the subject line, Wedding Planning Division, Summary. She had chosen a private dining room at the Alderton Club, a place with white tablecloths and oil paintings of men on horses and the particular hush of rooms where money has been comfortable for a very long time. 28 guests. Both families, the wedding party, Daniel's closest friends from graduate school. Robert's business partner and his wife, who Sandra had invited over my mild objection on the grounds that they were practically family. The kind of practically that means Sandra wanted them there. I wore a dress the color of deep plum. I had bought it 3 months earlier and had not told Sandra what I was wearing because Sandra's habit of coordinating everyone's outfits was one of the smaller battles I had decided not to fight. I did my own makeup. I drove myself. I arrived 7 minutes before Daniel because arriving together would have meant riding with his parents, which I had politely declined on the grounds that I needed to drop something off on the way. I had not needed to drop anything off. I simply needed 7 minutes of silence in a parking lot before I walked into that room. Renata had sent flowers for the tables at my request, white ranunculus and eucalyptus in low arrangements that were elegant and quietly mine in a room that was otherwise entirely Sandra's. Nobody would know that. I knew it. I sat down. Sandra embraced me at the door. She looked beautiful. Cream silk, pearl earrings, the practiced warmth of a woman who had been hosting these events for 30 years. She held my hands and looked at my face and said, "You look wonderful, Evelyn." She said it the way she said most things. With complete sincerity and no awareness that I was watching her for something specific. I had given her 2 weeks. 2 weeks to call me, to text, to mention in passing that she had spoken to some of my vendors and cleared up a misunderstanding. She had not said one word. Not one. I smiled back at her. "This room is beautiful, Sandra," I said. "You have such an eye." She squeezed my hands. "We're going to have the most wonderful wedding." "We are," I said. And I meant it. Just not for the reasons she thought. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The dinner itself was warm, genuinely so. Daniel's father gave a toast that was short and gracious and moved half the room including me. My own father, who had driven up from Pennsylvania that afternoon, shook Robert's hand for a long time and then sat beside him at dinner and discovered they had both coached youth baseball in the 80s. They talked about it for 40 minutes. My mother wore the blue dress she'd bought for the occasion and laughed at something Daniel's college roommate said and looked, for the first time since we'd arrived in Pembroke Hills, completely at ease. I watched Sandra watch my mother. I watched Sandra recalibrate. My family was not what she had expected, which is to say they were warm and funny and completely unimpressed by the oil paintings of men on horses. Sandra managed it gracefully. She was always graceful. That was never the problem. After the main course and before dessert, Sandra stood and gave a toast. It was polished. It mentioned Daniel's qualities in specific terms. It mentioned my name 4 times, which was 4 more times than I had been certain it would appear. She called me a wonderful addition to the family. She said she looked forward to many years of shared holidays and memories. She looked at me while she said it with the particular expression of a woman who is not lying, exactly, but who is curating. Who is presenting the version of events she has decided is true and therefore making it true through presentation alone. I raised my glass when everyone raised their glasses. I smiled when everyone smiled. I did not say anything I had not already planned to say. The conversation I intended to have was not going to happen at the rehearsal dinner. It was not going to happen in a room full of his father's business associates over dessert and good brandy. It was going to happen at the wedding. At my wedding. Planned by me, paid for by me, documented in every detail, in a room where everyone who mattered to both of our families would be present. I had one conversation that evening that was not planned. After dinner, in the marble-floored corridor outside the private dining room, I found myself briefly alone with Robert. He was getting a glass of water from the sideboard in the hallway. He handed one to me without being asked. We stood together for a moment in the quiet. Robert Hollis was a man of few words in the way that some men are few words because they have learned that the people around them will fill the silence and in the filling reveal everything. "You planned the whole wedding yourself," he said. It was not a question. "I did," I said. "Every contract is in my name." He nodded. He looked at the painting on the wall across from us, another man on another horse. "Sandra means well," he said. "I know she does." He looked at me then. "She's going to be surprised." "I know," I said. "I've given her every opportunity to come to me first." He nodded again, slower this time. The nod of a man who understood the architecture of what was about to happen and had decided his role in it was to stand in the hallway and give a glass of water and say nothing more. He went back into the room. I finished the water. Then I followed him. The wedding morning was the 14th of June. I woke at 6 without an alarm. My apartment was quiet. I had slept alone the night before, a decision Daniel and I had made together and that I was glad of because I needed those hours of silence before everything changed. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the contracts folder open in front of me, not because I needed to review anything but because I had spent 8 months building something careful and true and I wanted to look at it one more time before the day began. Every vendor confirmation was there. Renata's final flower count. The Whitfield and ceremony and reception timeline. Cara's shot list. James's catering run sheet with every dietary note accounted for. Dr. Patricia Voss's program, which was 4 pages long and perfect. I looked at the folder for a long time. Then I closed it. I got dressed. I put on the dress I had selected 6 months earlier, a gown with a structured bodice and a simple skirt that moved when I moved and had cost me $2,400 from a designer whose sample sale I had attended twice before finding it. I had not shown Sandra a photo. She had asked 3 times. I had told her it was a surprise. The Whitfieldens' garden was everything I had imagined when I had stood in it alone on a cold November afternoon 8 months earlier and looked at the late afternoon light coming through the elm trees and known. 83 chairs in ivory linen. Ranunculus and eucalyptus on every row and in low clusters. The string quartet arranged at the edge of the garden path, Dr. Voss at first violin, her musicians in black, warm and precise and absolutely worth every cent of the $3,200 I had paid them directly. The smell of old wood and something like honeysuckle from the property's garden beds. Cara was already moving through the space, unhurried, seeing things through her lens before anyone else had arrived. She caught my eye from across the garden and gave me a small nod. The kind that means, I have you. I have all of it. Everything was exactly as I had contracted it to be. Because everything had always been in my name. Sandra arrived with Robert and Daniel at 11. I was inside with my mother and my maid of honor, my closest friend from graduate school, a woman named Philippa who had once told a contractor who tried to shortchange us on a project that she would not hesitate to involve every licensing board between here and the state capital, and had meant it. She was exactly who I wanted in my corner on this particular morning. I heard Sandra's voice in the corridor before I saw her. She was speaking to the inn's event coordinator, a young woman named Grace who had been my primary contact for 8 months and who had Sandra's name nowhere on her list of authorized contacts. I heard Grace's voice, polite and firm. All event details are coordinated through Ms. Carmichael directly. Let me let her know you've arrived. A pause. Then Sandra again, warmer, redirecting. Of course. I just wanted to check on the floral arrangements. Bloom and Branch completed setup this morning, Grace said. Ms. Carmichael signed off on everything at 9. Sandra walked into the getting ready room 2 minutes later. She looked at the room. She looked at my dress. She looked at the flowers on the dressing table, white ranunculus in a small vase that Renata had included as a gift with a card that said, "Congratulations, Evelyn. Every bloom is yours." Sandra's expression did something complicated for just a fraction of a second. Something I would have missed if I had not been watching for it. Then she smiled. "You look beautiful," she said. She meant it. I believe she genuinely meant it. "Thank you, Sandra." I kept my voice even and warm. "I'm so glad you're here." She looked around the room again. At Philippa. At my mother. At Grace, who had quietly positioned herself near the door. "Everything looks lovely," Sandra said. "Did you work with the inn's coordinator on the flowers?" "I worked with Renata at Bloom and Branch," I said. "We've been working together since October." A pause. Small. Almost undetectable. "How lovely," Sandra said. "I'm sure they did a wonderful job." "They did exactly what was in the contract," I said. And I let that sentence breathe. The ceremony was at 1 o'clock. 83 people seated in the garden under the elms with Dr. Voss playing something gentle and unhurried as the guests arrived. My father walked me down the path between the chairs. He smelled like the same aftershave he had worn my entire life, and his hand on my arm was steady in the way of a man who is holding himself together with both hands because his daughter is getting married and he is not going to cry until he absolutely has to. He absolutely had to at the second verse of what the quartet was playing, and he did it quietly and with tremendous dignity. Daniel was at the end of the path looking at me the way he looks at me when he thinks I am not watching him, which is the way I decided I wanted to marry him. The officiant was a friend from my firm who had become ordained specifically for this purpose and who had known us since we were colleagues before we were anything else. The vows we had written ourselves. 16 minutes, start to finish, which was exactly what I had planned. The reception was in the inn's main hall. Round tables with linen the color of warm cream. James's team had set up the food stations with the quiet efficiency of people who have been doing this long enough to be invisible in the best possible way. The first course was a roasted beet salad with whipped goat cheese that I had tasted at a tasting 6 months earlier and had thought about at least twice a week since. The bar was open and the wine was the specific bottles I had chosen from a list James had sent me in March. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be because I had contracted every element of it myself and no one had the authority to change any of it. Sandra found me between the first and second course. She had been watching the room for the past hour in the particular way of a woman who is looking for the seams. For the evidence of who had made the decisions. The Whitfielden instead of Rosecliff. Renata instead of Whitmore Floral. 83 guests instead of 350. A string quartet instead of a band. She was doing the math. I could see it. I waited. "Evelyn," she said. She sat down beside me at the head table while Daniel was across the room talking to Robert's business partner. Her voice was composed. Her hands were still. She had been preparing this conversation too. "This is all very beautiful. Thank you. I wasn't aware you had finalized so many things on your own. She said it gently. She said it the way a woman says something she knows is a confrontation while maintaining the structure of an observation. I finalized everything, I said. Every vendor, every contract, every deposit and final payment. It's all in my name. A pause. I did try to help, she said. I spoke to a few of the vendors to see if I could, I know, I said. She stopped. For the first time that day, Sandra Hollis stopped completely. I opened the small clutch I was carrying. My wedding clutch, ivory satin, practical size, chosen specifically because it needed to hold my phone, my lipstick, my card, and a single folded piece of paper. I unfolded the paper and placed it on the table between us. It was a printed summary. 1 page. At the top, a list of 5 vendor names. Below each name, the date and time of Sandra's call, the name she had given, the claim she had made, and the reason the cancellation had not been processed. Below that, a screenshot of her text message. I think we should start fresh with the planning. I've taken care of a few things that weren't working. Sent 12:07 p.m. on a Wednesday. 6 weeks before the wedding. Sandra looked at the page. She looked at it for a long time. The room was loud around us, the warm noise of a reception going exactly as planned. Daniel's college friends were laughing at something near the bar. My mother was dancing with my father. Dr. Voss's quartet was playing something from the program I had approved in April. You kept records, Sandra said. Her voice was very quiet. I always keep records, I said. I'm an architect. Documentation is how things get built correctly. She looked up from the page. I met her eyes. Sandra, I said. I want us to have a good relationship. I want Daniel to have his mother in his life. I want whatever children we have someday to know their grandmother. I want all of that genuinely and completely. She was very still. But I need you to understand something clearly. This marriage, this wedding, this life we are building, it belongs to Daniel and me. Not to you. Not to your vision of what his life should look like. You do not have the authority to make decisions in my name. You do not have the authority to cancel contracts I have signed. And if you try again, what I have documented here will be a great deal more uncomfortable for everyone involved than this conversation. I folded the paper. I put it back in my clutch. I smoothed the skirt of my gown. Sandra sat across from me with her hands flat on the table and something in her expression that I had not seen there before. Not anger. Not the wounded retreat she used when she felt cornered. Something older and quieter. The expression of a woman who has just been handed the truth in a language she could not reframe. I didn't think you'd done all of it yourself, she said finally. I know, I said. That's why you thought you could undo it. The words were not cruel. I had not said them to wound her. I said them because they were true and because Sandra Hollis had spent her son's entire life moving through a world where her assumptions about other people's limitations had always been correct. Until today. She looked at me for a long moment. The band of color high on her cheekbones was the only visible sign of what was moving through her. The wedding is beautiful, she said at last. And her voice was different. Still composed. Still Sandra. But something in it had shifted. The particular frequency of a woman who is recalibrating. It is, I said. Because every person in this room was hired by me and contracted to me and showed up for me. I stood. I smoothed my skirt again. And now I'm going to go dance with my husband. I walked back out onto the floor. Philippa caught my eye from across the room. I gave her the smallest nod. She pressed her hand briefly to her chest. Daniel was already moving toward me through the crowd, his hand out, his face open, and I reached him and took his hand and we danced. The fallout did not arrive the way I had expected. I had anticipated a phone call. A text. A message routed through Daniel in the careful way Sandra used Daniel as a channel when she wanted to say something she didn't want to own directly. What I got instead was silence. Not hostile silence. Not the pointed, weaponized kind that announces itself by being louder than noise. The genuine kind. The silence of a woman who had been handed something she was still trying to understand. Robert called Daniel the Sunday after the wedding. He told him the wedding was one of the most beautiful he had been to in years. He said Evelyn had clearly put tremendous work into every detail. He said he wanted to take us to dinner when we were back from the honeymoon. He did not mention the conversation Sandra and I had at the reception. Daniel told me this in our hotel room in Portugal, sitting on the edge of the bed with the window open and the sound of the city coming up from the street below. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I said, Robert knew. Daniel nodded. He's always known. I thought about the hallway at the Alderton Club. The glass of water. She's going to be surprised. Robert Hollis had spent 38 years married to a woman of tremendous will and capable management, and he had developed, in that time, the particular talent of a man who knows when something is going to happen and has decided his role is to stand nearby and not get in the way. I respected that more than I had expected to. Sandra called me herself on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the wedding. I was in my kitchen unpacking groceries. The call came at 6:47. I saw her name on the screen and I stood still for a moment with a bag of pasta in my hand and I made a decision. I answered. Evelyn, she said. Her voice was different. Still composed. Sandra Hollis would be composed at the end of the world. But the particular frequency had changed. The management register, the one she used when she was steering a situation, was gone. What was underneath it was something I had not heard from her before. She was not performing. I owe you an apology, she said. She said it cleanly, without preamble, without the architecture of explanation and context that people build around difficult words to soften them into something more comfortable. I owe you an apology. 5 words, undecorated. I set the pasta on the counter. I'm listening, I said. She told me she had been wrong. Not that she had meant well, not that she had been trying to help, not that she hoped I understood her intentions. Wrong. She told me she had spent 34 years managing Daniel's life because managing it was how she had expressed love and that she had not understood, until she was sitting across from me at a table at my wedding with a piece of paper between us, that managing and loving were not the same thing. She told me the wedding was more beautiful than anything she could have planned and that she had known at the moment she walked into the garden and saw the light through the elm trees. She said she was sorry. She said it twice. The second time was quieter than the first. I stood in my kitchen with the window above the sink letting in the late evening air and I listened to my mother-in-law apologize and I believed her. Not completely. Not in the way that erases what happened and begins fresh and pretends the last 8 months were a different story. But enough. Enough to work with. Enough to build something careful and honest on top of. Thank you for calling me directly, I said. I know that wasn't easy. No, she said. It wasn't. I meant what I said at the wedding, Sandra. I want us to have a real relationship. I want Daniel to have his mother. She was quiet for a moment. I want that too, she said. On terms that belong to both of us, I said. A pause. Yes, she said. On terms that belong to both of you. We talked for 22 more minutes. About Portugal. About the honeymoon. About a dinner Robert had mentioned wanting to organize. It was the first conversation we had ever had that did not have a current running beneath it. No steering. No assessment. Just 2 women talking about ordinary things in ordinary voices. It was not everything. I want to be honest about that. One phone call does not undo 8 months of attempted control or years of a dynamic that Daniel had been navigating his entire adult life. But it was a beginning. And a beginning that Sandra had chosen to make herself, without being asked, without being maneuvered, was worth more than any apology I could have extracted. The external shape of the fallout was smaller than I expected, in the way that these things often are when they happen at private events rather than public ones. 83 people had been at my wedding. Some of them had seen Sandra's expression when she walked into the garden and found everything arranged and ready and entirely outside her control. Some of them had noticed the particular quality of the conversation Sandra and I had at the reception, the low voices, the single sheet of paper, the way I had stood and walked back to the dance floor after. Nobody had heard what was said. But Pembroke Hills, like all specific communities of a certain size and social density, is good at reading the room even when it cannot hear the dialogue. Within 2 weeks I was aware, through channels I had not cultivated and did not particularly want, that certain people in Sandra's orbit were updating their understanding of me. The woman they had assumed was passive had turned out to be something else. Not aggressive. Not combative. Something more specific and therefore more notable. Organized. It was the word I heard used twice in different contexts by different people. Evelyn is very organized. The way the word was said told me it was carrying more weight than its surface meaning. It meant she was paying attention. It meant she had prepared. It meant you cannot manage someone who has already thought 3 steps ahead of every move you plan to make. I did not correct the characterization. Organized seemed fine. Cara sent me a preview gallery from the wedding 4 weeks after. I opened it on a Saturday morning sitting at the kitchen table in our apartment, Daniel still asleep, coffee going cold in the mug beside my laptop. The photos were everything I had imagined when I had stood in Cara's studio 12 months earlier looking at her portfolio and known she understood light the way I understood structure. There was a photo of the elm trees in the morning before the guests arrived. A photo of Dr. Voss adjusting her bow at the edge of the garden path. A photo of my father's face during the processional that I have not been able to look at directly since without my chest doing something complicated. There was a photo from the reception that I had not known Cara had taken. It was of Sandra. She was sitting alone at a table for just a moment between conversations, her hands in her lap, looking at the room. Not at any particular person. At the room itself. At the ranunculus and eucalyptus in their low arrangements. At the warm light from the inn's chandeliers. At 83 people moving through a space she had not designed and had not planned and could not have arranged differently if she had tried. The expression on her face was not what I expected. It was not wounded. It was not performing. It was something I can only describe as the beginning of understanding. The face of a woman who is looking at something beautiful that was made without her and is discovering, slowly and not without difficulty, that beautiful things can exist outside of her control. I did not put that photo in the album. But I kept it. Renata sent flowers to my office the week we returned. A small arrangement, white ranunculus, with a card that said, "It was an honor to work with someone who knew exactly what she wanted." I put them on my desk. James sent a note saying he hoped the food had been everything I had envisioned and that he looked forward to the next event whenever that might be. Dr. Patricia Voss sent nothing, which was entirely consistent with everything I knew about her, and then 3 weeks later forwarded me an email from a colleague at the university who had attended the wedding and wanted to inquire about booking the quartet for a private event. She had added 2 words at the top of the forwarded message. Good work. From Dr. Patricia Voss, on a Saturday, unsolicited, that was an ovation. The Whitfield and coordinator, Grace, sent a brief professional note and then a separate personal email 2 days later in which she told me that in 4 years of working events at the inn she had never seen a couple's contracts more thoroughly documented, and that the documentation had made her job genuinely easy from start to finish, and that she hoped I would think of the Whitfield for future celebrations. I replied to every one of them. I kept every note. What I lost in this story is something I want to name honestly, because I think the naming of it matters. I lost the version of this relationship that I had hoped for when Daniel first took me to dinner in Pembroke Hills on an October evening with the leaves still orange. The version where Sandra and I understood each other early and built something genuine without the obstacle course in between. I lost 8 months that were harder than they needed to be. I lost sleep and I lost the low-grade pleasure that the engaged months are supposed to carry, the lightness of planning something joyful, which was present but always threaded through with vigilance because vigilance was what the situation required. I do not want to minimize that. Something was taken from those months by the need to defend what was mine, and the loss of it is real even though the outcome was good. I want to be honest about that because I think the stories we tell about these situations often rush past the cost on the way to the vindication, and the cost is part of the truth. What I gained is harder to name because it is less concrete but more permanent. I understood something about myself in those 8 months that I had suspected but had not fully tested. That I could hold my ground without raising my voice. That patience is not the same as passivity. That documentation is not paranoia, it is the language of accountability, and accountability is what happens when someone who expected you to be manageable discovers you have been quietly and completely unmanageable the whole time. I understood that the preparation was the power. That Sandra's plan had failed not because I had outmaneuvered her in the moment but because I had built something she could not undo before she ever thought to try. And I understood something about Daniel that I had trusted but not yet proven. That when it came to it, when the thing was real and in front of him and required a choice, he would stand beside me. He had told me to document everything. He had sat at my kitchen table and looked at the contracts and nodded and said nothing that asked me to make it easier for anyone. That kind of quiet steadiness is worth more than I can calculate, and I have not stopped being grateful for it. Sandra and I have dinner now on the first Sunday of every month, alternating between her house in Pembroke Hills and our apartment in the city. The first few were careful. Navigated. The particular politeness of two people who are building a new version of something after the old version didn't work. By the fourth or fifth one, something had started to loosen. She asked about a project I was working on and I told her about it in actual detail and she listened with genuine interest. She told me about a garden renovation she was planning and I had thoughts about the structural drainage and I shared them and she wrote them down. Not because she needed my professional expertise. Because she was listening. We are not the same. We will not be the same. She will always want to arrange things, and I will always want to own what I have built. But those things are not incompatible. They are just two different kinds of women learning to be in the same room without one of them trying to redecorate it without asking. I think we are going to be all right. I think it will take time and attention and the occasional direct conversation, and I think we will have all of those things, and I think it will be enough. Robert still gives me a glass of water in the hallway sometimes. It has become, without either of us saying so, a kind of signal. A reminder between the two of us that we both knew what was coming and we both waited for the right moment. I appreciate that more than he probably knows. I am an architect. I spend my professional life understanding that the difference between a structure that holds and one that fails is almost never visible from the outside. It is in the foundation. It is in the documentation. It is in the decisions made before anyone arrives on site, before anyone picks up a single tool, before the building looks like anything at all from the outside. The Whitfield Inn is still standing. The elm trees in the garden are still there. Somewhere in a folder in my filing cabinet is every contract, every receipt, every vendor confirmation from a wedding that was planned entirely by me and paid for entirely by me and took place exactly as I had designed it. 83 people ate James's roasted beet salad and danced to Dr. Patricia Voss's string quartet and looked at Renata's ranunculus in the late afternoon light coming through the trees. None of them, with the possible exception of Philippa, knew what was underneath it. The months of quiet preparation. The vendors who held the line. The single sheet of paper placed on a table at a wedding reception between two women who needed to understand each other. That is the thing about a foundation. It does not need to be visible. It just needs to hold. And mine held. If this story gave you something, recognition, or relief, or just the satisfaction of watching careful preparation pay off exactly the way it was supposed to, I would love for you to drop a comment. Have you ever had to quietly document and defend something that was yours? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who assumed you hadn't thought ahead? Tell me. I read every single one. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.